James Rule. I'm the compliance consultant with OxLEP, so I'm responsible for making sure that all the systems, processes and requirements for the Growth Hub's European funded programs are met. Apologies for the delay in starting. We're finally in a position where you can not only see me but also hear me. Restart of laptop number 3, so we're doing well. So we will press on. Next slide, please. Thank you. So the overview of the agenda, fairly straightforward. The first part is listening to me, give an overview of the Go-create grant scheme and the process. So that covers things like eligibility, the background to the grants, how you apply, the key rules that grant applicants and recipients have to follow, and the key dates, so the forthcoming deadline and notification dates. I then do a brief 15-20 minute session on why applications are unsuccessful. So this is pointers learned from 20 odd years of assessing grant applications. And then I'll be joined by Sophie Lee, Programme Executive for ISfB, and Peter Russell, Business Advisor for ISfB, for Q&A session on Go-create grants. You can type questions into the chat function within GoToWebinar, and if the team can answer them as we go through, they will type the answer back in. If not, we'll pick them up in the Q&A session. Please make sure that your questions are generic and don't contain any business confidential information, because everyone on the webinar, all the participants, will be able to see them. If we finish the webinar and you immediately think of a question that you wish you'd asked us, please just email it across using the innovation@oxfordshirelep.com email address. Next slide.
Good morning, everyone. We seem to have lost. No, James is back now. James, we can see you.
Okay, hopefully you can hear me again now.
You can, James. You're back.
Thank you. I got a slightly worrying message about audio connection gone. I've been and poked the machine. I think it's working. So I'll press on quite quickly in the hope that this doesn't happen again. So a bit of background to us. Who are OxLEP? We're the Oxfordshire Local Enterprise Partnership, one of a network of around about 29 local enterprise partnerships around the country. We're responsible for supporting business growth and skills and inward investment within different geographical areas. The Go-create grants as part of the Innovation Support for Business programme fall under the OxLEP Business and Growth Hub, part of the organisation. All of the local enterprise partnerships operate a Growth Hub to provide business support to local businesses. These range from what you could describe as a full service Growth Hub, so one that delivers workshops, webinars, face-to-face one-to-one support, through to a simple telephone service and not much else, down to online resources. And the ISfB programme covers the Growth Hub's innovation-related business support activities. Next slide. Thank you. So given that ISfB and the Go-create grants are European funded, the elephant in the room, if you like, is what changes have come about as a result of the UK's departure from the European Union. The simple answer is none. The programmes, despite our exit from the EU, remain part of the European Structural and Investment Funds programmes until they close down in a couple of years' time. Therefore, they continue to be governed by the EU regulations and the UK Managing Authority's guidance, which is based on those. So it is, from the point of view of these programmes, business as usual. Next slide. So who's eligible? The short version of that, the answer to that question is SMEs. So an SME, a small and medium-sized enterprise, is an undertaking, a business that has less than 250 employees. It is no more than 25% owned by a business that is not itself an SME. So if you're 50% owned by Microsoft, you will not be eligible. However, if you're 50% owned by a venture capital company, regardless of the size of that venture capital company, you are eligible. Things like venture capital and university ownerships do not affect the SME status. If in doubt, please ask us. We've been through this many times over the years. We're perfectly happy to advise. You'll also need to have either one or both of the following: a turnover less than 50 million euros a year and a balance sheet less than 43 million euros, both based on your previous year's accounts. Next slide. You also cannot be an undertaking in difficulty. This is set out in the regulations. It doesn't include any SME less than 3 years old, but it includes anyone who is subject to insolvency proceedings, or if you've received rescue or restructuring aid. In both those situations, you will know if you're an undertaking in difficulty. But effectively, for companies, the test is whether or not you've lost more than half of your subscribed share capital as a result of accumulated losses. Now, due to the COVID-19 pandemic, this test now takes place looking at the age and financial position of the business at the 31st of December 2019. And that's to try and make sure that businesses are judged on the basis of their pre-pandemic position, rather than following the impact of COVID-19, when a significant number of businesses would probably fail the test. At the moment, that flexibility has been extended to the end of this month. So the grant round that closes in June for undertakings in difficulty will be looking at the state of the business as at 31st December 2019. It is possible that that will be extended further. And if it is, we'll continue to apply the relevant flexibility. It's a simple calculation based on your last full year of accounts that you've submitted to Companies House, or the age and position of the business at December 2019. When you signed up to the ISfB programme, you will have completed a self-declaration within that form showing that you're not an undertaking in difficulty. It's beholden on us and the regulations to check for undertaking in difficulty status. If anyone applies for more than £50,000 worth of aid, which is unlikely for Go-create grants, we're obliged to formally check whether you're an undertaking in difficulty. Otherwise, we have to do random spot checks of applicants. Next slide. My next slide just maps out how this works in practice. So if your share capital was £10,000, you have no accumulated losses, clearly you pass. Similarly, share capital of £10,000, if you have accumulated losses of 4,999 or less, you pass the test. On the same share capital, if your accumulated losses are £5,001, you will fail the test because you've lost 50.01% of your share capital. And similarly, if accumulated losses surpass your share capital, you'll fail the test. For any businesses that don't have share capital, effectively you cannot have any accumulated losses to offset because there's no share capital to set it against. We recommend that you speak to your accountant. We can advise on this, but it is always worth speaking to your accountant. And the little formula there, capital plus profit and loss account, must be greater than or equal to capital divided by 2, is the acid test. So we're happy to advise on this. You may also want to speak to your accountant if you're in any doubt. Next slide. So in terms of the key eligibility issues, staff costs are not eligible for Go-create grants. There are no staff costs allowable. Consultants, people who are paid on invoices, are perfectly eligible, but staff, anyone on salary, anyone with an employment contract who goes through PAYE, those costs are not eligible for Go-create grants. VAT costs can only be included if you're not registered for VAT or if you cannot recover that VAT from HMRC. And please seek advice on this. We are not VAT experts and we cannot give VAT advice to applicant businesses. We do require an audit trail for procurement. So for anything less than £25,000, or 24,999 in fact, we require copies of 3 quotes for those items. That's to demonstrate to an auditor that the public funding has been spent in line with public procurement requirements. If you're spending anything £25,000 and above, so over 24,999, this has to follow an open procurement process. So at minimum, that requires a contracts finder advert and a specification on your website, formal scoring of responses received before the deadline, formal notifications in line with the various requirements, and there's things that you need to tell people in those notifications. We will work with you to walk you through that process because this is the area of the programme that is the most risk for applicants. One problem that often comes up is that people want to continue using suppliers who are already involved in the applicant's business. This is not in and of itself a problem, but you must be able to demonstrate that you followed the 3 quotes or a proper open procurement process to select this supplier. All of the costs on the programme are based on defrayed costs, so the money has to have left your bank account before you can claim it. That doesn't mean that you can't buy things on credit cards. You can. It just means that the audit trail for that has an additional step in it. For any normal item, the audit trail is an invoice and then a copy of the bank statement, redacted, of course, that shows the payment from your bank account meeting that invoice. For a credit card, you'll have the invoice, you'll have a copy of the credit card statement, and then the defrayal element will show you making a payment from your bank account against that credit card to at least the value of the item that you've purchased. People sometimes also want to use overseas bank accounts to make payments. If you're ordering something from abroad and you have an account that uses the local currency, it makes sense to avoid transaction fees by making payments from that bank account. That's fine, it's acceptable, but please let us know that you plan to do this so that we can work with you to understand primarily the exchange rate that you'll be applying to the overseas bank account. The issue that we have here is that your invoice and your defrayal will be in, I don't know, euros, US dollars, whatever it may be. The amount you're reclaiming from us will be a sterling figure that therefore doesn't match, it's not the same number as the euro or US dollar amount. We need to understand and be sure that you're using an exchange rate that the auditor will accept to translate the foreign currency amount into a sterling amount. Again, please let us know and we'll work with you to make sure that there are no queries on that when you put the claim in. Next slide. So just to make a distinction, the Go-create grant scheme is a revenue scheme. So for in ERDF world, a capital item is any individual item that costs £5,000 or more, excluding VAT. So if you're buying things rather than services, provided they cost less than £4,999, excluding VAT, they are a revenue cost, so they're acceptable. If those items cost above £1,000 but less than £4,999, they're what's known as a mobile asset, and that means that we have to record them on the project asset register with details such as the serial number, the location, depreciation process, that sort of thing, but also some photos of the asset in situ. So this just demonstrates to the auditor that yes, it was really there and it was really in your office, factory, workshop, wherever it may be. What I would say when thinking about those photos is that sometimes we get some very nice photos showing a particular asset and absolutely nothing else. We need some slightly wider shots to show the asset in place. The problem the auditors have is that if there's a nice close-up photo that shows nothing other than, say, the 3D printer, that 3D printer could quite easily be living in somebody's garage or home office or something, rather than the business facility that it's expected to be in. So as I've said, any item over £5,000 is capital and it's not eligible. We did have a capital element within the programme, but there was no interest, no take up on that, so we've withdrawn it. Next slide. So what can't we fund? I've mentioned salary costs. Anything that goes through PAYE is not eligible. We can't fund travel and expenses costs, and as I also mentioned, VAT payments that you can recover from HMRC. We can't fund debt or refinancing, so anything with an interest element, nor can we fund any statutory or legislative requirements. So what does that mean? That means that if you're developing your innovation and there is a legal requirement to have a certain certification to a certain standard, that is not something that we can fund. We can fund consultancy support to advise you on it, but we cannot fund the costs involved with achieving that certification. If, however, there's a certification that is a nice to have, we'll be able to sell more of our product if we have this, because it's the level above the legal requirement, for example. That's absolutely fine. That's an eligible cost for Go-create grants. We can't fund training. Now, this doesn't include leadership and management development, things like mentoring. But it does mean that specific training courses leading to some form of certification or qualification are not eligible. And that's because the European Social Fund, ESF, is the European programme that funds training. We can't fund any hire purchase arrangements, again, because that has a debt and interest element to it. And we can't fund vehicle purchases. Next slide. We really seriously can't fund vehicle purchases. This is in here twice deliberately, and that's because it's something that auditors who come into Oxfordshire do look for. Many years ago, there was an ERDF programme in Oxfordshire that had an underspend, and decided that the best way to make up that unspend was to go out and buy a car, which they did. So the auditor, and it is still frequently the same auditor who comes to audit the programs, had to correct that, had to claw back the money for the cost of the vehicle. So it is actually something that they do explicitly check for when they look at Oxfordshire programs. We can't fund like-for-like or routine replacement or preventative or remedial maintenance for things. So if you have a machine that needs replacing because it's wearing out and you want the exact same make and model to do exactly the same as it used to do before it wore out, that's not something that we can cover. If you're replacing machine with one that will do twice as much, that will do it differently, allow you to bring new products, absolutely fine. That is an eligible cost. We can't support the building or refurbishment of retail facilities, and there are some very specific sectors that we cannot support. Primary production of agricultural goods and fisheries, so no fish farms, and unfortunately no farms. We can't support road freight. We can't support services of general economic interest. Now, normally when I used to deliver this to a live audience in a room, I would look round and see how blank the expressions were about services of general economic interest. Effectively, it's public sector type activities. So it's the sort of activities that OxLEP undertakes. It's things like the NHS, it's things like schools. We can't fund export related activities. Now that doesn't mean that you cannot then export whatever innovation we've given you a grant to help develop. It means that you can't use the grant specifically to set up a network and infrastructure in order to export. Okay. Nor can we fund activities favouring domestic over imported goods. So if your grant application came to us and said, we will only use UK products, we will not consider overseas products as part of our innovation, that is something that would not be eligible. So that would be anti-competitive, so it's not going to be eligible. Next slide. Thank you. As you can imagine, there's a series of deliverables that we have to report on. We report on the amount of grant that we've paid out and the amount of match that you as grant recipients have put into your projects. That's easy. We know those from the claim form. We also have to report the employment increase. So that's the new jobs created as a result of the grant. And we need to report things like the number of hours, the salary level, and some equalities data on the individual filling it. We need to report on the new products introduced to the firm and to the market, collaborations with research institutions, which really should be on this list, and new businesses supported, which is just, in our world, businesses less than 12 months old. Again, we already know that, so that's easy. For the others, for the employment increase, the new products and the research collaborations, evidence is needed, and as you would expect a compliance person to say, there's a form for that, which will be part of the grant offer letter. Next slide. So ISfB itself, as a program, has three strands. There was the development of innovation facilities, the Eco Business Centre, and the Agile, and the slide should still say prototyping labs up at Begbrook. Unfortunately, the co-working space didn't happen, but we also deliver a series of business support innovation products. So that's one-to-one sessions with business advisors and one-to-many workshop type sessions. And we also have the Go-create grants. The program was delivered by OxLEP as the lead delivery partner, and the partners whose activity ended late in 2020 listed on the slide. It was the University of Oxford, the City Council, Sherwood District Council, and the University Hospital Trust. Next slide. So how much is available? we still have just under a quarter of the grant pot available. The original budget for Go-create grants was 875,000. We've committed just over £665,500. There's too many sixes in that number. So we have uncommitted 23.9% of the pot, £209,375.22. The maximum grant we anticipate giving anyone is £50,000, and the grant rate is a maximum of 25%. So at most, you'll recover from us 25% of your total costs. Next slide. So what can you spend the grant money on funding? They are, as I've said, revenue costs, and there's a wide range of things that the grants can fund. Investment in product and service development, research, both technological and applied, excuse me, development of pilot lines, any actions around early product validation, in fact, all the way through to first production. So it's all the way through the innovation and commercialization journeys. Next slide. Thank you. So I said it has to be innovation, as well as being an SME. You have to have an innovative product that you're building. Now, we take a very wide approach to interpreting innovation. It can be a product, it can be a process, it can be a service, and the image on this slide is supposed to convey the breadth of activities that are eligible. By all means, talk to the team, talk to our innovation advisor about your innovation project, and the level of innovation that may be in there, because that's one of the questions within the application form. You need to demonstrate to the members of the grant panel how innovative your project, your application is. Next slide. Thank you. So how does it work in terms of the financials? So if we make a grant offer against total eligible spend of £40,000, which should just say revenue only, the maximum grant that we would offer against that is £10,000, which is 25% of the total eligible spend. So you spend your £40,000, you'll claim back 25%, which is the £10,000. Very simple. We do know that innovation projects don't work like that. So in scenario 1, your total eligible spend is lower. It comes in at £30,000. The maximum grant we can pay is then reduced to £7,500 because it's capped at 25% of your total cost. The second scenario is where you overspend, so your total eligible spend goes up to £50,000. In this instance, the maximum grant we can pay is capped at £10,000 because that is the maximum grant that we offered. So you will get the lower of 25% of your total spend, or the maximum sterling value of the grant that we offer. Next slide. Thank you. So how do you apply? Read the guidance on the website, you can speak to the team, rewatch the recording of this webinar, which will be made available, complete the application form, and there is a very useful checklist. In fact, there's two of them, one for procurement and one for completing the application form, making sure that you have all the attachments. They're really useful. I know they are, I wrote them. So please make sure that you use those and then wait and see. Okay, we will notify you in line with the timescale that we've set out. Next slide. Which is also set out in the table on this slide. So we have a cut-off date on the third Friday of every month at midday. and we will then notify you of the outcome. It should be within 3 weeks or on 3 weeks of the cut-off date. If we think for any reason that timescale will slip, because, for example, we've had lots of applications, we will let all the applicants know. So please don't worry if you haven't heard from us before the notification date, so 3 weeks after you submit your application. We're working on it, we're working through it. So this month, the cutoff date is in 15 days' time, so it's the 18th of June at midday, and we will look to notify people on or by the 9th of July. The July cutoff date is the 16th, and third Friday is 2 days earlier, again at midday, and we'll look to notify people by the 6th of August. Please note that we're not at the moment able to offer the soft check proofreading service that we did in the very first few rounds of the ISfB program. Should that change, we'll let everyone know. Next slide. So just to reiterate the rules, we can only reimburse defrayed expenditure, so money that has gone out from your bank account, that you incur, that you defray after the date of the grant offer letter. Okay, so please don't spend any money, please don't enter into any contracts until the point at which you have a grant offer letter. The procurement rules are quite critical. 3 quotes are required. Evidence for all of this is key. We do need an audit trail to show each step in the process. So I then normally ask a slightly rhetorical question about whether we are being flexible or rigid. The answer to which is that we're as flexible as we can be within a fairly rigid framework. Next slide. Thank you. Just have a little more coffee. So we're now moving into the part of the presentation where I do a session on why applications are unsuccessful. There's a reason I deliberately pitch it this way, which is because this is a competitive process. If you follow all of the hints, tips and advice that I would give in a how to write a successful application webinar, there is still the potential that you will be unsuccessful in this process because it is competitive. So I pitch it as the things to avoid based on my experience of assessing far more applications than I would like to remember. So the first thing is length. And I always say think Goldilocks when you think about length. So your application should be neither too long nor too short. It should be just right. So in some ways that's an utterly unhelpful piece of advice. But what it also means is that the word length we give you in the application form is not a target. If you can tell us everything that we need to know in order to assess the application in fewer words than the word limit, that's absolutely fine. The word limit is not a target that you use. There are no prizes for writing 3,000, 5,000, whatever the word limit is, words in an application, rather than a shorter, more succinct, clearer application form. The critical thing is to give us the information that we need in order to assess the application. Please don't be obtuse. Don't use long and complicated words like obtuse. Try to keep it clear and simple. You will be experts in your field. It's your business, after all, it's your innovation. That means that the people who are assessing it, although they have expertise in various different fields, we can't guarantee that they will be experts in the specific area of nanosystems or medical devices, or I did see one application once that had half a page of chemical formulas on it. This is potentially interesting, but is a poor use of space in an application. Explain it so that somebody who is not a subject matter expert can understand it. Think about style. I say spell checker is there for a reason. It is worth flagging at this point that no application will ever be failed on the basis of style. We don't fail people because there are spelling mistakes. We don't fail people because there are grammar mistakes. The risk, however, is that applications that are poorly spelt or poorly written, if they are so poorly written that we can't understand them, it's not possible for them to achieve high scores. And also, assessors are human. If as they go through an application there are sentences that don't make sense, words misspelt, it will worry them. Assessors will start to query the degree that there is an attention to detail and whether that lack of attention to detail will feed through into the project delivery. So please use the spell checker and please have somebody check it, have somebody proofread it for you. Applications can be unsuccessful due to the quality elements. In the simplest terms, they can be rushed. So take your time. If you're starting to write your Go-create grant application now for the June deadline, then you have enough time to do a good job of writing a grant application. If you're starting to write that application at 9 AM on Thursday, the day before the deadline, you've almost certainly left it too late. So advice would be to not rush for the deadline the next day, submit it for the month following. I would say use our checking service, but as I've mentioned, we're not able to offer that at the moment. But please ask someone else, someone independent, preferably somebody outside of your business, friend, family member, whoever, to proofread your application, to check for things like spelling and grammar, but also to make sure that it tells the story, that it's clear, that it's simple, that it's understandable to somebody who doesn't live the innovation and the business idea every day. And consistency is another quality issue. What I mean by this is that if you're asking for a grant of £12,500 on page 1, please make sure that you're also asking for a grant of £12,500 on pages 3, 9, 12 and 14. In fact, everywhere else that the value of the grant appears. It's concerning to an assessor if the application is inconsistent. So if the grant value, this is the most obvious one, if the grant value or the project total costs change depending on which part of the application you read, it's very difficult for us to then assess the value for money because actually we don't know what the cost of the project is. So it's very difficult to give high scores there. And the last thing on this slide is to think about all of the questions, all of the boxes within the application form and fill them in. This sounds very simple, but when you're focusing on the text boxes, on the written boxes and the finance boxes, the number boxes, it's quite easy to skip over one of the other boxes and leave it blank. Go through the form and check that if a box is blank, you could put not applicable in there and the form still makes sense. So on the page that asks what other sources of funding have you explored, you can put not applicable in there and the form still makes sense, assuming that you haven't explored any other sources of funding. If, however, the box is for grant rate requested, for example, you can't put not applicable in there because the form doesn't make any sense. You will have a grant rate. There is no way that you can't have a grant rate if you're requesting a grant from us. On to the next slide, please. So content. One of the problems that we often find with applications, and again, this goes back to what I said about people being experts in their business area, is that the applications assume there is prior knowledge, a degree of prior knowledge that people have. Please don't assume that the applicant will have prior knowledge about your specific sector. Certainly don't assume that they will have prior knowledge about your innovation. Okay, that is very unlikely. So if you're writing it and you think, oh, it goes without saying that, it never does. Murphy's Law states that eventually you will come across an application assessor who will not have that prior knowledge. So you will make a statement that says, everybody knows the global market for this is huge. And the assessor will think, well, I don't. And there is no evidence, there's nothing to support the size of the global market. When you're writing it, start at the beginning, go on to the middle and finish at the end. Now, what do I mean by that? I mean that a lot of applications are unsuccessful because people are so keen to get onto the project, so what you're actually going to do with the grant, that they forget to set the context. They forget to say, this is the business, this is our history, this is what we do, and this is what we've got, and this is what we plan to do with the grant. And then at the end, and this is the impact that that project will have on the business. You are telling us a story. You'll see it's a bullet point. I don't particularly like that as a phrase, but I still haven't come up with a better one. But you're telling us a story. You're telling us what we need to know to be able to understand not only the grant project itself, what you want to do with the money and how much that will cost, but also how that fits in with your business itself and the impact that that grant project will have. So within all of this, you're thinking about the relevance of that content to the story that you're telling us. Do we really need to know the detailed chemical formula that relates to your innovation? Probably not. Do we need to know how that innovation relates to where the business has come from, the market that you're trying to access or that the innovation will go into, and the impact it will have on you? Absolutely, yes, we do. If you must give us that chemical formula because you think it's important or critical, it's probably better to put it in an attachment or an additional document that you supply. However, last bullet point on the slide, please use caution when providing attachments and additional documents. You're welcome to provide them, and there are some things that we specifically ask for with the applications, things like your business plan, your last set of accounts, but you are at liberty to provide additional documents as well. Please use them sparingly. The reason for this is that assessors are always time limited. So if you attach 350-page documents to your application, I can pretty much guarantee that assessors will not read them. They will not have time to read them, and we do not expect assessors to read things like that. If you attach two-page documents to your application, it's highly likely that an assessor will be able to read them. They'll have time to look through them. When you use attachments, it is best to tell us where to look. So if you must attach a 150-page research report, for example, within the application, it's best to say, and see pages 25 to 27 or 25 to 26 of research report attached. Tell the assessors exactly where to look, and it's much more likely that they'll be able to look there if it's a big attachment. Next slide. Thank you. So in terms of process, I've got a couple of three-letter acronyms here. RTQ, read the question. I always recount the story of a history teacher I had at school once who used to tell us before exams how she had once written the best essay she thought she'd ever written in her life in her final exam at university on 18th century France. and she had 5 minutes left at the end of the exam, so she flicked back through the question paper, as you do, and realized that it should have been 17th century France. Read the question. This goes back to not rushing. Take your time and think about what we're looking for. The questions for Go-create grants are split out with subsidiary bullet points, and that's supplemented by the guidance notes. So we do try to set out exactly what it is we're looking for. Once you've done that, most people can then guess ATQ, which is answer the question. We have a clearly defined score sheet that links back to the questions that we've asked. So if we've asked you about how innovative your product is, the impact it will have on your business, etc., there are score sheet questions that assessors use that link directly back to those elements. If you haven't really answered those parts in your application, you're not going to be able to score very highly. When we look at the procurement, when people are seeking 3 written quotes for anything worth less than 24,999, 3 quotes really does mean 3 written quotes. If it's impossible, then in an ideal world, you would have confirmation from companies that they cannot quote. And ideally, and although I must admit I've never seen it, you would have a confirmation that they can't quote and a suggestion that you go and talk to the only company that they know of who can do it, which is the company you have the quote from. Now, over the years, I have been forced to admit that there will be instances where 3 written quotes is impossible. The one I always use is Facebook advertising. If you're going to do Facebook advertising, the cost comes from Facebook. Okay, it doesn't come from anywhere else. And if Facebook is the platform you intend to use, there isn't really any comparative cost you can get. In that sort of instance, we'll accept a single quote, but please ensure that 3 quotes are provided if you need to. We don't expect anyone to go out and run an open procurement if you're buying anything more than £25,000 before we've awarded the grant. It takes quite a bit of time, quite a bit of effort to run it properly. So we would recommend that if you need to do that, you hold it until the grant has been awarded, and then we'll work with you to make sure the process is robust and audit proof. Next slide. Thank you very much. So when you have a grant, as I've said earlier, please wait until the grant has been awarded before spending it. If we award a grant on a Friday and notify you that you've been successful, if you went out and spent the money the previous Monday, so 5 days before you knew you had the grant, an auditor will say that you obviously didn't need the grant in order to incur that expenditure. Excuse me. In order to incur that expenditure, and therefore there's no added value. So wait until you have the grant before you spend it. Please then actually do spend it. We appreciate that there will be delays in projects, especially at the moment if something has to be shipped, but keep us informed. Excuse me. If there are delays, tell us, keep us informed, but please make sure that you do actually spend it. And then the third bullet point, which I always find difficult to believe, please make sure you claim it from us. We do occasionally come across instances where grant recipients have carried out the project, they've spent the money, they just haven't got round to claiming it back from OxLEP. Please claim it. We can't reimburse you until you've claimed it back from us. I've said that things will change and that things may be delayed. I'm going to sneeze again, I think. Excuse me. If there are delays or if anything changes, then please tell us. Running these sort of grant projects is one of those situations in which it is always better to ask for permission rather than forgiveness. If you're asking us before you change something, before you do something different, we can guide you and make sure that whatever it is you do, whatever it is you've changed, remains eligible. If you're asking us after you've done it, it may turn out to be something that under the regulations we cannot accept and we cannot reimburse. So please keep in contact with us and talk to us. And please make sure when you submit your claim that you provide the necessary evidence with it, the evidence of invoice and defrayal. If you don't, all that will happen is that we will come back to you looking for that evidence, and we're not able to pay any claims until we have a complete audit trail of evidence in place. Next slide. So we're nearly at the end. For more information, as I said earlier, you can watch this presentation again. You can watch the generic overview, which actually is part of this presentation. Slides and the guidance notes will be on the OxLEP website, and we do have Q&As published as frequently asked questions, which we update as new and additional Q&As come in after each webinar and after each email is received. Email any questions to the innovation@oxfordshirelep.com email address, and good luck with your applications. Next slide. It's now time to move over to questions. I know we started a little bit late, so I'm happy to run straight into the Q&A, unless we do want to maintain the coffee break. So next slide. Okay, so I will ask Sophie to join and to tell me whether we're just going to run straight into the questions or preserve a 5-10 minute coffee break.
Hi James, thank you, and morning everybody. I think we'll go straight through into the Q&A, James, and we'll just wait for Peter to join as well. Hi Peter.
There he is.
Morning.
Peter Russell is our innovation advisor, so he's joining for the panel. Thank you for joining, Peter, and thank you, James. We haven't actually had any questions through at the moment from attendees, so if you have any questions, just send them through on the chat and I can facilitate those through to James and Peter. Otherwise, you can obviously after the event send any questions you might have through to the innovation email address, or give us a call and we'd be happy to help. So I don't know whether there's anything you want to add at this point in case we wait for a few questions to come through from you, Peter or James.
I probably would just reiterate the point about proofreading. I think I was having my attack of sneezels at the point when I went through proofreading. It is very important as part of this process to ask somebody independent and preferably outside of your business, certainly outside of the team writing the application, to proofread it. If somebody who is not familiar with the subject area can follow it, then you're in a good position for an assessor to be able to understand and follow, and then award higher scores for it. It's very difficult for assessors to award high scores if they don't understand the application that's in front of them. And the trick with all of this is that applications are unsuccessful because they don't score highly enough. The trick is to put an assessor into a position where they can award higher scores.
Absolutely, thanks James. I guess also just to add to what James has presented this morning, just as some examples of the types of innovation projects that could be funded, things like investment in product and service development, technological and applied research, developing pilot lines, early product validation, first production. So just some examples of the types of projects that have been funded before. Peter, did you want to add any points?
Well, I haven't been on the webinar for too long, but if James didn't already make the point, then I'd like to say, if you're not sure if your project fits with the scheme, then rather than go to the bother of trying to fill out an application form, send us an email and just send us an outline of what you're thinking of doing, where you are with regard to your stage of business development or innovation project development, and what sort of costs are involved, and who you might be thinking of spending your money with, basically. And we can give you a bit of feedback on that to potentially save you the effort of a drawn out application, or indeed encourage you to go ahead. So let us know what your thoughts are before you go too far.
Absolutely, thanks Peter. We've got a few questions coming in now. So the first one, a startup incorporated at Companies House in September 2020, pre-revenue. How do we supply company accounts if we are pre-revenue?
You don't, is the simple answer. So if you're pre-revenue, what we ask for is a cash flow forecast for your first year.
Great, thank you, James. Second question on success rates. What's the typical success rate of grant applications? Also, are there limitations for defence, security, policing applications?
So success rate, very difficult to judge. It's somewhere between a third and a half of applications are successful, would be my view, I think, certainly over the course of the last year. It does vary. At the start of the programme, we were receiving a higher number of applications each round, unsurprisingly, and the success rate was lower. It was probably around 20–25%. It's crept up as time has gone on, but to be fair, we've received fewer applications each round because we run each round on a monthly basis. So we've smoothed out the demand. And what I think that means, what I hope that means, is that people are taking more time and feeling less pressured with their applications, so that what we're seeing are stronger applications, and therefore we're more able to support them. In terms of restrictions on, what was it, defence and policing, were they the examples
Defence,
given?
security and policing, yeah.
We wouldn't be able to support a police service or the army, but if you're a private company whose innovation supports those services or is sold into those services, then yes, you'd be eligible for support.
Thank you, James. Question, you mentioned photos of items as evidence being in an office setting and not in a home office. What about remote staff? Can items be purchased for their use that are not in the main office?
Good point. I need to update my my wording around that, don't I? The critical thing is that on the asset register, we have the details of the asset, including the serial number, and a location for where that asset is kept, where it lives. When the photo comes in, it needs to demonstrate that the asset is where you've said it is, where it's supposed to be. Now, if that is a home office, so if I had a printer as an asset, I would expect a picture of something that looks vaguely like my home office, hopefully tidied up a bit, with the printer in it. If I've said it's a 3D printer and it's going to live in our manufacturing facility, and it turns up in the photo in what is obviously somebody's home office, then it would be queried because the asset is not where it's supposed to be. And the risk with that is that the asset is not being used for the purposes for which it was purchased. So that's the critical test. The bigger problem, as I said, is not usually that the background looks wrong. The bigger problem is usually that you can't see the background, that you get a photo that is a 3D printer and about 2 millimeters of desk on either side of said 3D printer, and you have absolutely no idea where that printer is. It's a very nice photo of a printer, but it doesn't tell the auditor anything about where that printer could be located.
Thank you, James. A quick question, just can software products be funded?
Yes.
Easy one, quick one and an easy answer. Okay, a question on undertakings in difficulty. As a startup, we've purely been funded, funding the R&D to date from our own personal accounts. The company accounts therefore shows limited capital and high ongoing losses. The slide seems to imply this would disqualify a business, even though this is surely a normal way for a startup to start up. So.
Yes, he says unhelpfully. So if you are less than 3 years old, it doesn't matter. Okay, or you were less than 3 years old at the 31st December 2019, then it doesn't matter. But I have unfortunately come across some businesses, particularly large businesses, in fact, who expense their R&D costs through the P&L. So that means that they carry forward huge multi-million pound losses, cumulative losses, which means that they fail the test. They're not in difficulty in any sense other than the way that the regulation is written. Now, I have a whole lecture about things I dislike about the undertaking difficulty regulation that I think both Sophie and Peter have probably heard far too many times. It is a blunt tool, but it is a clear line in the sand, which is what they were looking to draw. If in doubt, please talk to us and we'll have a look at it. I have seen instances where businesses that fail undertaking difficulty test have been able to restate accounts or wait until the next accounting period and then they pass it. But it will really depend on the individual circumstances. So I would recommend that you have a chat with us first and we'll have a look at your individual circumstances with you.
Thanks, James. A question on the competitive process. So if our application fails on its first submission, is it permissible to resubmit the application the following month? Yes, it is. Usually we'll give you some feedback if your application wasn't successful, and yes, you would be welcome to apply again in the next round. Anything you wanted to add on that, Peter or James?
No, I think it's quite usual that the feedback is hopefully helpful. So we are, time permitting, able to provide a bit of feedback on a draft application. It's not always the case because people don't give us enough time. So if you do submit something which hasn't had any sort of help from us prior to submission, it's quite common that it'll come back with a few questions which we can help you address ready for the next submission date. Sometimes that's not possible because the timing is important to your project. So if timing is important, then I'd encourage you to share a draft with us as early as you can in the process, and we'll give you some feedback before it actually gets as far as a submission date.
Thank you, Peter. As the funds are limited and they're now only less than 25% of the fund left, does this increase the competitiveness and lower your chances of success, or do you move into the next fund if one fund is used up? How often are funds made available? So on this particular project, once that funding has been committed to but for grants, that there isn't at the moment any additional funding that will be through this particular programme. There may in the future be other funding available through other projects if OxLEP end up taking on those types of funding projects, but at the moment this is the amount available. So when that's committed, there isn't any additional funding. James, did you want to add about competitiveness on applications?
When we eventually get to the position of receiving more applications than we have funding available, then I think absolutely it's going to get a lot more competitive. At the moment, we're getting a couple of applications each closing date, so not a massive number, and they're not threatening to use up the whole of the 200 and whatever it was thousand that is available. So we're not in that end game, if you like, of trying to balance a small grant pot against a higher value of applications. It's still a competitive process. So what I mean by that is that applications will still get scored, they'll still get reviewed, and they will not all get funded, even if we could fund them all. But we're not in that business of trying to work out where we spend £20,000 of grant across £60,000 of applications. We will get there. And while Sophie was reading the question, I was wondering when I thought we would probably get there. It's going to be at a guesstimate round about the end of the year, start of next year is where I suspect we'll be in that position of higher value of applications than we have grant available.
Thank you, James. Just following on from Peter's comments, there was a question on is it possible then to send in a draft submission for review prior to the formal submission? Yes, it is. Obviously, further to Peter's comments, it kind of depends on how soon you send that before the deadline as to whether we'll have availability to review that for you. But yes, to try and send that over to us as far in advance as possible of the next deadline, and we'll try and review that and give you some feedback. Anything you wanted to add, Peter?
No, that's it basically. Yeah.
Perfect. Final question for the moment. The application form asks for an assessment of the potential impact of our innovation project on the economy. Is this the national economy or more local economy? Both, really. The panel will be interested to see the impact on Oxfordshire in particular. But yeah, but asked for both and scored on both within the panel. The panel will review both of those areas. I think that's all the questions we've got for the moment. Just double check there's nothing else there I've missed.
Just a quick comment on that last one, Sophie. I think we do recognise that impact is not easy to demonstrate. It's not easy to demonstrate in big programs like ISfB, to be honest, compared to small things like individual grants. But so I think creatively about what difference your innovation is making to communities and groups of people or customers, as well as the economy. And then I think James did make this point somewhere in his presentation: don't make unsubstantiated claims. So don't sort of say we're going to have this massive impact, but then go no evidence of how you've calculated it or done any calculations at all. So just kind of do your best on the impact thing. Basically, the panel want to support innovations that have some sort of meaning to them, rather than just sort of Me Too products or simply an impact on your own business and presumably your own pockets as well. So just think creatively, and I can talk that through with people if they're a bit stuck on that one.
Absolutely, thank you, Peter. That's all the questions we've had through. So thank you for all the questions and for being on the panel, Peter and James. If there are no other questions at this point, as noted before, please just get in touch on the phone or on email with the team, and we'll be happy to help. Any final comments, Peter or James, before we close off the webinar?
No, for me, just good luck and look forward to receiving your ideas.
Yeah, pretty much the same from me. Thank you for listening.
Yeah, thank you all for joining today. The slides and the recording will be sent, the links to the recording will be sent out in due course to everyone that's attended. And yeah, good luck with your applications, and thank you for joining today. Thank you, everybody.